congregation's amazing. One of the things that we have committed to here at First Church is, as this year has progressed, as we have tried to step forward into a new identity in a world that seems like it is fast changing around us, is becoming a church that listens, that learns, that teaches, that receives. I think that you see that right here as this spirit of openness to the world around us and to the gifts that are around us has allowed us to emerge as a community that is so filled with gifts and opportunities and more than we could have imagined had we kept our eyes on doing things the same way. And so sometimes that means me speaking less and you all speaking more. And today is one of those days. As you have seen, and for those who might be finding us for the first time, maybe you're watching us on the live stream, maybe you've been watching for a long time on the live stream and haven't necessarily seen some of the stuff that happens here inside the building as our other ministries flourish and emerge here. But one of the things that has really emerged is our ministry with our families, with our youth, and part of that has been because of some of the young adults that have joined and found us as a community of hope and of new possibility. And so one of those young people, I'm just so excited about the work that she does in the world. Some of those young folks are all college students, undergrads, seniors at Purdue. And one of those is someone who sort of stumbled into finding First Church not that many months ago now, became part of one of our Bible studies here at the church. And when we said, we're looking for young leaders, this is one of 4 who stepped forward and said yes. But it really excites me because this young person's passion for living out the gospel in new ways, taking the stories of God's people, including the ancient ones, the Isaiah story, that the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, believing that and saying this is how we can understand that today if we believe that the scriptures are true, that the prophets had something to say, that Jesus was real. And so I want to invite for our conversation today, Rebecca Eyrick to come forward. Rebecca, would you come on up here? Rebecca is part of our family ministry team, and I keep that broad because they are a group that multitasks. Whether it's working with the young folks, whether it's working with the youth, and just kind of like figuring out how that needs to happen. Rebecca and some of the others were hanging out yesterday for Lum Jubilee and making sure that the families that we were connecting with were serving. But Rebecca, tell us about yourself just a little bit. What's your major at that big school over there?
Yeah, so as Dwayne said, I'm a senior. I'm studying environmental public health, and I'm also doing some minors in environmental policy and women's, genders, and sexuality studies.
And one of our conversations was like, how does that intersect with your faith? Yeah, how do we hear that? And so we've had some rich conversations, but I think instead of asking you to tell us that, I think that will all be unfolded as you share your story and your invitation to us to hear God and where God is at work in the world today. So Rebecca Eyrick, folks.
Thank you. So I want to start out with a question today. How many of you have ever seen the 1995 animated Disney movie Pocahontas? Yes. So I'm taking a quick step away from our Grinch theme to look at another animated classic. Looking back, it has some problematic themes with colonization and misportraying the entire situation. But when I was a kid, it was my favorite movie. It was my favorite for specifically one part. When Pocahontas had to make a big decision and didn't know what to do, she would go to an old willow tree she called Grandmother Willow. Grandmother Willow would come to life and tell Pocahontas to listen with her heart to understand the best decision to make. See, I loved this part of the movie because I related to it in a way. I legitimately thought as a child that I could talk to the trees. I would whisper something, and the wind rustling through the leaves and the branches waving would be the trees talking in response. Grandmother Willow was all the evidence that I could ever need that I was actually talking with the trees. A lot of you might recognize me from my work here at FUMC and Children's Ministries, but I wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself. I'm 21. I'm from Northwest Indiana, a town called LaPorte. I'm a born and raised Methodist from a church that my family has attended for generations, and as I told you before, I'm studying environmental public health at Purdue. I was raised on a farm on one side of my family, and the other side of my family was made up entirely of environmental conservationists. So environmentalism is somewhat in my blood, and ultimately that's why I'm standing here in front of you today. If there's one thing I learned growing up in a countryside Methodist church attended by mostly farmers, it's that our faith and the environment are deeply intertwined. Our text today talks about a passage from the prophet Isaiah that describes a world before and after God comes to earth. It centers on environmental themes. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and blossom. The thirsty grounds will become springs of water. It centers on the fact that God's creation will rejoice with the coming of Christ. Not just creation as in humans, which is kind of obvious. We all know that we will one day be filled with the Spirit, but the land itself will be filled with love. Since the year 1880, global temperatures have increased by 0.14 degrees Fahrenheit per decade, but since the 1990s, that increase has doubled. This year, by the end of October, 44% of the United States had fallen into extreme drought. 2/3 of Europe fell under extreme drought in the first half of the year, and Africa faced the worst drought it has had in 40 years, putting 22 million people at risk of starvation. Ecosystems seem to be falling out, and pollinators are falling under extinction or endangerment. We see cases like the case of Flint, where drinking water became a commodity of privilege, or cases that show us the long-lasting impacts of redlining, where minority and disadvantaged neighborhoods struggle with higher levels of pollution, less access to resources, more food deserts, and less safe, clean public space. Looking at the text for some context, the previous chapter in Isaiah is talking about the vengeance of God. It talks about death coming upon the nations, bloodshed, these themes of scavenger animals and symbols of death dwelling in the land. Chapter 35, our chapter today, begins to flip this narrative and discuss the salvation of God. Essentially, that the beloved children of God will experience salvation from the aforementioned world of despair and bring them into the world of joy and really healing. Verses 5 and 6 talk about various forms of healing. The blind will see, and the deaf will hear, and the lame will walk. These verses bring into light the idea of an active God coming to right wrongs and make everything just. Walter Brueggemann, a very well-known Old Testament scholar and theologian, describes that there are two ideas here that are tied together. One, the restoration of God's honor, and two, the rehabilitation of God's people. The two cannot be separated. Additionally, these verses set the precedent for what we see Jesus fulfill in the Gospels when it is described that the blind now see, the deaf now hear, and the lame now walk. Jesus is setting right what God commanded and correcting the governance of the land for which Judaism had long awaited. These verses come back to environmental themes after that, including the idea that the land will become full and healthy, with water streams overtaking every symbol of death described in the previous chapter. What I find interesting about these verses is the idea that human survival and salvation stems from the environment in which they find themselves. That without these ecosystems flourishing, without growth of plants and animals, God's work will not be complete. The rest of the verses center on the joy of God's people as they enter into Zion. They rejoice, the land rejoices, God rejoices. This story centers around joy, pure joy, that will overcome the earth. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow, no evil creatures will be found, only the righteous. The joy will overcome these people, and they will walk into eternal peace with gladness and joy. Of course, we are working towards this joy. True salvation comes at the hand of God, but in the meantime, we're working on it. Conservation and preservation centers have worked to decrease elimination of key species and keep ecosystems intact. Small steps are being taken towards renewable and clean energy. For example, renewables are set to produce more energy in 2022 in the United States than coal for the first time ever. Technology is ever improving to find solutions for drought, plastic waste, pollution, and high emissions. For example, France banned certain domestic flights in favor of train travel to reduce emissions. Bike buses are being created in Spain to get children to school safely without the need for regular school buses. Researchers have figured out a way to make homes out of wood fibers to make homes more sustainable. New technology in Australia has been able to remove toxic chemicals from rainwater. New farming methods are able to reduce emissions, and power outages in Nigeria are being overcome through solar lamps made from e-waste. And people everywhere are becoming aware of the dangers of environmental negligence. People like Greta Thunberg and Mariana Kopeny, you might know her as Little Miss Flint, are raising awareness and taking action to overcome climate change. Organizations like Sunrise and Citizens Climate Lobby, both of which have Purdue chapters, are working to advocate for climate-safe legislature. People are starting to create initiatives to bring resources into disadvantaged communities. Research is exposing the dangers we face, and the climate missions started decades ago are being carried on by a new generation. This generational discipleship, something we also see time and time again in the Bible, such as the people of Moses in the Promised Land. This is where we come into play. It's no secret that our community of West Lafayette and Indiana at large have their fair share of struggles. When you look around, environmental issues are not hard to find. Indiana has the highest proportion nationally of blue-collar jobs, meaning there are tons of factories and production companies here, and people work with a lot of heavy machinery. These can cause emissions of gas and other particles that can be extremely harmful to individuals and their communities. While I've been here, I've calculated the church's carbon footprint, made efforts to improve recycling here, and started working towards some larger projects that I hope will carry on after I graduate and I'm no longer working here. But why does any of this matter in the first place? I mean, we are all aware of the climate crisis going on around us, but what does that have to do with our church? You see, in our passage and throughout the Bible, God is asking us to be disciples, to follow God into the everlasting joy we are promised as God's people. A cornerstone to this discipleship is environmental stewardship. We are called to take care of God's creation, to not let it be destroyed, as seen in the text with bloodshed and environmental disaster. We are called to be caretakers of earth, to get as close to that lush world of natural wonder as we can. The world is already a beautiful and glorious thing. It is living and worshiping alongside of us. We are not to treat it as a simple tool, but as guests to God's wonder. We must take steps, even in our own small ways, to take part in creating change and love through the environment. We could help make a system for gardens in the church that can be spread to other churches in the area, invest in composting, give your time and resources to what you think may be the best choice, whether that be something as small as reusable dishes in the brunches. Only through this are we really making accessible contributions to our mission of discipleship. Because in my time at this church, if there's one thing I know that we care, and we love, and we want to do our best to show God's love as much and as often as we can. That is what First is, and that is what being a child of God is, and that is who we are. Thank you.
Amen.